Really? You sure? Okay then. So remember in that last Orc Life Coach video I talked about putting together an Orc Samurai army? Well, it's being led by this boy right here, Orka Nobudakka. Which, yeah, it's a really thinly veiled reference to Oda Nobunaga. I mean, come on, it's like looking in a mirror, right? Really quick shout out to Mortar for sculpting this bad boy. But it's not just the name I wanted to borrow. I wanted to build my big OC war boss around Nobunaga himself as well. And you might be wondering, why Nobunaga? Isn't he like the worst of the three great unifiers and overall terrible monster of a human being? Well, the easy answer is, yeah, but remember, this is Orks. But the real reason is because I just really like old Nobunaga. Like, if you ever go back and watch my old Witch Samurai videos, that Kamon crest that I wear in my samurai hat, yeah, that's Nobunaga's. So, yeah, I just really like this guy, and he stands probably as my favorite historical figure in the Warring States period. But much to my chagrin, movies, video games, anime, and even historical documentaries love to give him a bad rap, labeling him as this demonic, unfeeling, bloodthirsty lunatic devil of a man who just wants power and control. That's not who Oda Nobunaga was. At least, I don't think so based on all the research I've done on the guy. I mean, was he purely altruistic? Absolutely not. But neither was literally any other daimyo at this time. More on that later. Despite being Orky levels of both brutal and cunning, Oda Nobunaga had reasons to do what he did, and I think it gets overlooked by way too many people. So, y'all want more Orks? Y'all want more OC lore? You want more Japanese history? Well, let me roll all of that together in one and explain why I love Oda Nobunaga, why he's completely gotten an unfair rap, and how he's directly inspired my favorite OC war boss. So let's start with the easy one here, Dakka. Historically, Oda Nobunaga really loved guns, and being a Midwestern-born American, so do I, at least in fantasy. Now, according to the Shincho Koki, Nobunaga began his marksmanship training from an older commander named Hashimoto Iba back in 1550. Then, 4 years later, having realized how much easier it is to train someone using a gun versus Yumi bows, he armed 500 of his 1,300 troops with matchlocks during the Battle of Muraki Castle and won in a single day. But Nobunaga's greatest example of Dakka use? Well, that would be the Battle of Nagashino, where he completely obliterated Takeda Shingen's so-called invincible cavalry with the first historically recorded use of the three-line volley system. Just non-stop hails of bullets! Isn't that the exact same strategy that the Orks have with their shooting? Just stacks on stacks of Dakka, filling the air with more lead than breathable air? Well, Nobunaga was the first guy to really pioneer it in Japan. This is why I wanted Orka Nobudakka to have more guns on his person than functioning limbs. Because despite Nobunaga not being the first daimyo to use guns on the battlefield, he was certainly the one to use it the best. You might also notice that Nobudakka's default has 3 massive clusters of guns, 1 on his back and 2 on each arm. Well, that was a design choice to reflect Nobunaga's domination with the 3 gunline system during the Battle of Nagashino. Pretty killy, right?
Megama, Zenbu Megama.
The other thing I'm sure that sticks out with Nobudakka is his body is completely mechanical, except for his head, which is the only true green skin thing on his body. Well, in my headcanon lore, Nobudakka believes that the best way to crump is to have the best souped up cyborg body you can get, stronger than muscle and more resilient than any mega armor. Not to mention it's way easier to bolt on more Dakka to your body. And the inspiration behind this came from another aspect of Nobunaga's interest in modernization. We already talked about how Oda Nobunaga was big on advanced military weapons like guns, but Nobunaga was also theoretically big into modern armor. I say theoretically because technically there hasn't been any historical account of Nobunaga wearing Nanban Gusoku armor. Despite popular media constantly putting him in it with that big red cape, most historians speculate that Nobunaga's quote, real armor was the usual Domaru armor and Jinbaori coat that a lot of samurai wore at the time. But that hasn't been historically proven either. So here's the thing. Nobunaga, being a powerful warlord, likely had multiple sets of armor that he would use. And with Nobunaga historically being not only personally interested in European goods as outlined by Louis Freud's History of Japan, but more interested in European tech for use in battle, I'd actually be shocked if Oda Nobunaga didn't use or at least own a set of Nanban Gusoku armor. Here's why. Unlike Domaru Gusoku, which is a lamellar armor with strung plates, Nanban Gusoku is a solid and sloped chest plate. Not only was it harder to penetrate due to being a solid piece of chest plate metal, but its sloped design deflected not just spears and swords, but bullets. Bear in mind, guns were introduced long before Nobunaga came to power back in 1543, so why wouldn't Oda Nobunaga, the man who historically was known for snubbing old traditions and fancying all things Western, not have, if not use, a set of modern armor? I'm not saying he chronically wore that kind of armor with that red cape that we see in popular media, but I don't buy for a second that Nobunaga would purposely snub Nanban Gusoku with how forward-thinking he was about modernization. There are hundreds of museum pieces of Nanban, so it's not like it was an extreme rarity in Japan. So why wouldn't Nobunaga have it? Likewise is the logic behind Orka Nobudakka. But wouldn't you kids not have the best armor the teeth could buy?
Or boys, tatakai jikan da ze!
Something I didn't show you guys in the last video was not only the sheer amount of Samurai Ninja Orc boys Orka Nobudakka had, but also that a big chunk of them were cyborgs just like him. While I do think that orcs are awesome, and cyber orcs are even more awesome, my headcanon with Nobudakka is that he cares more about what his boys can do and properly equip them to be as dead-odd as they can be. Silly as that sounds, this is actually another thing about Nobunaga that I think makes him stand out compared to other daimyo of his time, and why I think he's the bestest. Where a lot of other warlords cared more about where you were from and what family lineage you had, Nobunaga didn't seem to care about any of that in the slightest. All he cared about was the capacity of others and what they could do for him. You remember Yasuke? Yeah, don't worry, you're gonna hear plenty about him when Ubisoft releases their next Assassin's Creed game. Yasuke was a Portuguese slave, but Nobunaga was impressed with what he had the potential to be. After some solid conversations with the guy and a really awkward bath, Nobunaga actually acquired Yasuke, freed him, gave him a sword, a house, money, and a position as one of his personal retainers. That's huge! No other time in well-recorded Japanese history save for William Adams was a foreigner given the rights and power of a samurai. And this isn't just an isolated event either. There's been plenty of examples in history where Nobunaga found value in common folk in martial and logistical roles. I mean, that's how Toyotomi Hideyoshi got to power. Now, despite orc warbosses being at the top of the food chain, so to speak, I've never once seen or heard one of them in Warhammer books, games, or tabletop that didn't want to get stuck in with the boys. Sure, they wanted to be there before the boys, but they never wanted to be there alone. So, in a weird way, that kind of spoke to me when I was doing my headcanon for Nobudakka. Nobunaga in history cared a whole lot more about his boys than most other daimyo and made sure that they were equipped for Krumpin regardless of what clan they came from. Why should Nobudakka be any different? So one aspect of Nobudakka that my headcanon straight up stole from Nobunaga was the manipulation and puppeteering of people in power. What are you? Alright, so I mentioned in the last video that I had another goofy OC that I thought up named Ghazghkull, the boy with the golden gob and instantly regrown teeth. Teeth being the currency in Orc society, you see. But because of this, Gorgon had been locked up and essentially farmed for teeth by a Goth clan until he escaped with his Grot Urgrat. You can't make much of a mob when you're trying to lay low, so there were only a few other mechs and boys with Ghazghkull when Orka Nobudakka and the Rising Sun mob found him. But rather than locking him up and constantly beating his gob for teeth like the Goths did, Nobudakka instead offered himself and the Rising Sun boys to mob up with Ghazghkull and his small group of boys, essentially faking loyalty to Ghazghkull cause he had a golden goose right in front of him, and Nobudakka ain't the boss that's above a little misdirecting cunning being a blood axe and all. But the boys knew that Nobudakka was the biggest and the strongest, with Ghazghkull just being the teeth bank they had to keep happy in order to continue to manipulate. I am so sorry for anyone who has no interest in Warhammer lore. I'm sure that sounded like a bunch of gobbledygook, but it makes me happy. But what would you say if I told you that Oda Nobunaga of history did the exact same thing? Minus the teeth stuff, of course. Yeah, the only reason why Nobunaga was able to technically reach the power that he gained as a unifier was because he claimed to be working directly with the true heir of the shogunate of the time, Ashikaga Yoshiaki. During the Onin War, which was the other civil war that happened prior to this one, Ashikaga Yoshiaki's brother, Yoshiteru, was murdered and the long reign of his family was deposed. So hearing about this up-and-coming superstar of a samurai, Yoshiaki went to Nobunaga and asked him to help return he and his lineage back to their rightful place as shogun. Nobunaga, being as cunning as any old blood axe orc, said of course he'd help Yoshiaki, until he could get power for himself. This gave him the legitimate excuse of marching directly onto Kyoto as he proclaimed that he was returning the rightful heir of the shogunate back into power. Kinda hard to argue that. And he in fact succeeded. In 1568, Yoshiaki was made shogun, but he was Nobunaga's puppet shogun. And as many of these kinds of relationships end, Yoshiaki was overthrown by Nobunaga himself in 1573 after tensions finally boiled over, officially making Nobunaga shogun and the first unifier of Japan. And that's some true proper cunning right there. Now, was this a dishonorable underhanded trick by Nobunaga to gain ultimate power? You better believe it was! Would have made any blood axe proud. But it was a trick that every other daimyo in Japan would have been happy to do in order to obtain ultimate power. Remember, the Warring States period was a country the size of California, split into dozens of different fiefdoms, all fighting each other to become the biggest and the strongest. God, the sengoku period really is just all orc behavior, isn't it? My point is that any daimyo from any of these warring fiefdoms would have been this level of cunning to get to power. One of the things that utterly irritates me about people's perception of Nobunaga is that he somehow was uniquely cruel in his actions, but bro, actually read up on samurai history at the time and tell me with a straight face that the majority of the other daimyo weren't capable of this level of cunning brutality. The only reason we peg Nobunaga as being this evil daimyo is because history remembers his actions a lot more closely and specifically than most others due to his position as a great unifier. In fact, let's talk about that for a hot sec. Alright, so I did a bunch of OC lore dumping, now I gotta do a bunch of history rage dumping. If you're only in this video to hear the funny orky stuff, you might want to skip this part. Okay, the two things that people always seem to point to when they talk about how brutal Nobunaga was were his actions in dealing with the Iko-Iki and the province of Iga, wherein he burned multiple Buddhist temples of the Iko-Iki to the ground and killed every last man, woman, and child. Doing the same with the population of Iga not too long after. Lazy historians like to say it's because Nobunaga was a cold-hearted monster who murdered anyone who stood in his way. But to that I say, no, it's not that simple. Let's start with the Iko-Iki. First of all, the Iko-Iki weren't just a bunch of warrior monks like a lot of people say they were. The Iko-Iki were a collection of some warrior monks, some samurai who were disillusioned with the long-running civil war, and tons of common folk even more displaced by the civil war. 50 years prior, there was a Pure Land Buddhist leader named Nenyo Shonin who taught the importance of equality in a country that was, and still is, founded on rigid hierarchy. As the war got worse, the Iko-Iki, or Single Mind League, eventually overthrew their local samurai shugo governor, Tanayasu Yatsutaka, in 1488 and claimed the province of Kaga for themselves. So let me ask you something. You have a near-fanatical militaristic group of some Sohei monks, samurai, but mostly common folk who overthrew samurai rule. What do you think was going to happen when the biggest samurai on the block rolls up and proclaims that he wants to reunify Japan and stop all the fighting? They're not gonna do it. In fact, they're gonna fight against it. And just by the way, the presence of the Iko-Iki wasn't just in Kaga. They had HQs at Ishiyama Honganji, Nagashima, and in Nakuchi, with that latter one being on Mount Hiei, which was just a stone's throw away from Kyoto and the shogunate. Even if Nobunaga left these guys alone, I seriously doubt they would have just kept to their temples and not went after Nobunaga, considering just how much they hated samurai rule, either attacking him directly or trying to recruit more people to their cause, thus breaking the country back apart. And it's not like Oda Nobunaga opened up his attack on the Iko-Iki by burning everything to ground and killing everyone. Prior to that act, Nobunaga sieged both Ishiyama Honganji and Nagashima for 10 years. 10 years! That's longer than any other samurai siege that lasted in Japanese history. Enough was enough. If the Iko-Iki weren't going to integrate into a unified Japan that Nobunaga was making, what else could he do? The second point of order. Nobunaga burned down and slaughtered every man, woman, and child dwelling in and around the temples that he was sieging. That, without context, is freaking horrible. But within context, I kinda see why he felt like he had to do it. Remember, the Iko-Iki were not just a bunch of Sohei warrior monks. They were a militant force comprised of all demographics, mostly common people. And after 10 years of hard fighting, you'd think that Nobunaga would see this and realize that he wasn't just fighting monks and samurai, but also common folk that were heavily armed. So how could he trust that a commoner was actually just a commoner and not a militant member of the Iki? Nobunaga wasn't just gonna sit around and get stabbed in the back when he wasn't looking. Look, I don't like the fact that he did this, but I completely understand why he did it. When everyone is a potential warrior, what else could he do? And the same thing applies to the Tensho-Iga War. Iga was not a province run by traditional samurai. It was a confederation of 12 military families called the Iga Soko Iki. Yeah, we got another Iki to deal with. They were not going to accept traditional samurai rule and actively fought against it. And again, Oda Nobunaga and his son Nobukatsu were fighting not just samurai, but civilian militia. Anyone could have been a fighter, so it was again hard for him to discern who was a warrior to fight and who was a peasant to leave alone so that they could farm. Look, I get it. The Iko Iki and the Iga Soko Iki were just utterly sick of 200 years of civil war. I get that they wanted to break off from that giant mess and forge their own path, but they couldn't exist in a vacuum, especially the Iko Iki. They weren't going to pay taxes, they weren't going to follow a centralized law. I mean, could they have survived as a micronation? Maybe, but that's like saying Texas could secede from the United States successfully. Maybe they could pull it off, but it would be a logistic and resource nightmare. Did Nobunaga do some really brutal and cunning things to win? Yes, but I cannot help think that he had to given the situation, and why he deserves a lot more credit than history's given him given the situations that he was thrusted in. Okay, back to Orky nonsense.
Fuzoke no omae.
So this is another thing that gets Nobunaga labeled as evil, but considering the context, I find it to be both hilarious and extremely orky. A lot of people know that Nobunaga referred to himself as the Demon King of the Sixth Heaven, essentially in Buddhist terms, the devil. But this isn't something he regularly called himself. This was a response to Takeda Shingen. Shingen, having heard and seen Nobunaga brutally tear into the Iko Iki and making himself public enemy #1 to Buddhists, sent him a missive. And again, this is in accordance to the compilations of Louis Freud. Shingen, a fervent Buddhist, gave refuge to the survivors of Endakuchi and heavily bragged about being the protector of Buddhism, declaring war against Nobunaga and signing the missive as Tendai no Zasu Shamon Shingen, essentially declaring himself a deity who protects Buddhism. Meanwhile, Nobunaga read this missive, couldn't care less, and signed his name as Dairokuten Mao Nobunaga, Demon King of the Sixth Heaven Nobunaga. I mean, who says Japan doesn't get sarcasm? This response was so thick and mocking with irony, I could see it dripping off the page. Nobunaga was not declaring himself to be some evil demon king, he literally said,
No you.
Within the limitations of Japanese propriety, that was the most orky response he could have given. Shingen blushes himself up and Nobunaga simply says,
Saga.
Not so much an example of how he directly inspires my OC, but more along the lines of how his attitude was so absolutely orky and why I love him so much.
Oi, uragirimono.
And just like most orc war bosses in 40k, Oda Nobunaga was overthrown by one of his nobs, a senior retainer to Nobunaga named Akechi Mitsuhide. Now history gives a lot of reasons why Mitsuhide eventually betrayed Nobunaga. Nobunaga embarrassed him one too many times, insulted his family, Mitsuhide thought Nobunaga was nuts, but for whatever the reason, on June 21st, 1582, Mitsuhide with a detachment of samurai stormed and set fire to Honnoji Temple, where Nobunaga and his other retainers were staying for the night, ending Nobunaga's reign in fire and blood. A pretty orky way of going out, all things considered. I'd imagine at some point either Ghazghkull or one of Nobudakka's other nobs would be the reason he got taken out, but such is the orky way. So let me ask you this. Would you want to get your hands on a unique model of Orka Nobudakka? Well then check this out. After that last video, I had an orc model shop called Gearguts Workshop reach out to me wanting to strike up a deal. Now I love Gearguts. Most of my proxies I use in my armies are by these guys because they're so freaking tasty. They have hands down the best take on orc mecha. And they have more than just what you could proxy for your favorite grimdark tabletop game. You want mech orcs? Got 'em. You want tons of pirate orcs? Got 'em. You want Goblin Rebellion units? Got you covered. You want redneck orcs? Easy. Orcs and Space Marine power armor? Got that too. Trucks, tanks, and mechs ranging from the small to the gargantuan? Bro, like I said, they got everything. So here's how it works. If you use the link that I have in the description and use the coupon code Gaijin Goombah, all caps, for every 10, 25, and 45 sales over $10, we get to create a custom war boss that they'll create and sell to the public. That means we can actually make Orka Nobudakka, Gorgan Glitstock, and all these dumb OC boys that I've got in my head available to pick up publicly. And again, I can 100% vouch for these guys when it comes to quality. So if you want to help me bring my wacky OCs to life and get them for yourself, please be sure to check out Gearguts with the link in the description and use the code Gaijin Goombah. I do get a kickback for everything sold, but dude, I don't even care about the money. I just want to make some OC boys. But either way, everyone, thanks for watching. And a tremendous thank you to my patrons. I know this wasn't exactly what some of you expected when you wanted to hear me rant about how Nobunaga wasn't as bad as history says, but I did get to happily gush about something I really love, so I hope that was at least enjoyable to listen to. And trust me, we ain't done with Nobunaga yet, because I still gotta compare him to his sucky successors. But I also have lots of things that I'm really interested in that I just can't shut up about. Buddhist self-mummifying monks, Japan being a living liminal space, how modern taiko drums came from jazz. I got a lot to talk about, so sub up, get notified, and check back every other week or so for even more edutainment videos. But until next time, everyone, this is Gaijin Goombah, signing out.